Shapiro, Microsoft Real, worked at a startup called WildSeed that was doing a Linux-based cell phone for teenagers back in 1999, if you can believe that. Went to Real Networks, worked in the gaming space for a little, and then got the crazy itch to go quit my job and start a full-time company. And that company was called Ontella, now called PhotoBucket. It was an amazing experience. I actually went the first 9 months of Ontella, from when I quit my job at Real Networks, presented at the Alliance of Angels, and said, that's it, we're going for it, to the moment the first check cleared was a hair under 9 months. So 9 months of me spending almost all my time, well, maybe about 2/3 of my time fundraising, 2 co-founders, with nothing to show for it. And then, of course, in 1 week, getting 6 term sheets, $500,000 of angel money, because, boy, in this business, when it rains, it pours. So started this company Ontella. We ultimately raised about $30 million in venture capital, merged the company with PhotoBucket, where I'm now on the board of directors, and we're doing really cool things with photography, both on the web and, of course, on your phone. And I left there after having an amazing run, a fantastic time, much the wiser, thank you, much the wiser for the experience, and started a new company called SparkBuy. And that's what I'm going to talk to you here about. It actually wasn't 9 months from incorporation to exit. It was, I think, a few days under 6. So it was a pretty intense ride. But that makes it a great topic for us to talk about today, because I can hopefully fit all the good stuff into a succinct amount of time. So let me tell you a little bit about SparkBuy. So this, what you see right here, this is SparkBuy. The idea behind SparkBuy was to make it ridiculously easy to find the best consumer electronics for your personal needs. You could do things like click on cheap and fast, and boom, there would be the fastest and least expensive laptops as measured completely by objective metrics, by the processor speed, the CPU speed, the speed of the hard drive, how many gigs of RAM, et cetera, and a whole bunch of interesting math on the back end to go make this stuff work. It lets you search for things like a fast red laptop that's Photoshop compatible. And in general, it gave you all sorts of opportunities to do stuff that you couldn't do any other place on the internet in terms of the flexibility of search and in terms of the simplicity of the interface. So I want to tell you about the experience I had in doing SparkBuy. Very intense, and because it was the second time around, I got to do some things right that I'd sort of learned from my prior experience about. So let me start out. The first thing was, when we started Ontella, we were kind of all in and pushing. I had 2 co-founders, and we were pushing really hard on one idea. In SparkBuy, I decided I wanted to fail as many times as possible simultaneously. So when I left my full-time engagement at PhotoBucket and went to go start something new, I brainstormed a ton of ideas and started building as many of them as possible in the lightest way possible, all at the same time. The lean startup is a great sort of template for doing this. At the time, I was working on, let's see, a service that would deliver you prank calls from India on your birthday, an opt-in version of Big Brother that would monitor everything you do and broadcast it to the whole world. I forget what the third one was, but I had 3 ideas, and I actually built up viable versions of each of these with duct tape and outsourcing and you know, lots of wizard behind the curtains. But I had one problem, which was my laptop. Well, my son ate the shift key. He was 1. And he kind of popped it off and put it in his mouth, and I couldn't figure out how to get it back on again. So I needed to buy a new laptop, and I had this really frustrating problem, and I'm picky about laptops, and I knew exactly what I wanted. Wanted to be less than 4 pounds, have more than 8 hours of battery life, have Bluetooth, and 1 or 2 other things. And I was looking all over the internet, trying to find some source that would help me with this problem. And finally, in a fit of frustration, I went, and it takes a ton of your time to manage, but it's cheap. So if you're somebody who does not mind diving into the weeds, micromanaging, Googling fragments of code to be sure that they're not just copying and pasting from other sources in the internet and giving you stuff that's, you know, copyright infringed, hiring 3 people and managing them all in parallel because probably only one of them will be successful, holding them to milestones and realizing that if you forget a milestone, then they get to claim that, that you accepted the work and you wind up having to pay them even though the stuff didn't work. If you're okay with all that, it is a phenomenal way to get products built cheap. I actually built the prototype for Ontella using outsourcing, even though we had a technical co-founder. The majority of it was built using outsourcing, and built all 3 of the products that failed, as well as the one that succeeded, through low-cost outsourcing on this sort of vWorker bit-at-a-time platform. So this was a phenomenal way that I could take my rather limited engineering skills and turn them into a whole bunch of different projects for not too much money. But if you're a good developer, you're better off doing it yourself. You'll have better code and it'll go just as fast. So that's, I think, one of the reasons why you see so many different results. So as I started to think about what I wanted to do, I started talking to every person I could imagine about the ideas. One of the things that I've noticed is that there's this funny sort of distribution about how people think about stealth mode, about secrecy. A lot of first-time entrepreneurs are deathly afraid of talking to anybody, while at the same time having the urge to talk to everybody, and there's this terrible tension between the two. What I found is that the people who you see in TechCrunch all the time, these very successful entrepreneurs who are in stealth mode for like a year and everybody's speculating, and people think that's a role model, it's actually not. If you're one of these folks who's been the CTO of Facebook or whatever else it is, you can be in stealth mode for a year and everybody will pay attention to you and you'll have no trouble getting attention. But for us mere mortals, it really helps to have eyes on your project. And your project will not die because somebody copied it. It will die because nobody knew about it. Nobody paid any attention to it. So I got out there as early as I can, talking to everybody possible. I'm not talking about press. John, I don't know if you're here. Kurt, I see you're here. Wasn't talking to you guys, but talking to everybody else who was in the industry, who was in the space, as often and as frequently as possible to get ideas, to get impressions, to get some sense of feedback. In particular, going back to this idea of I don't trust entrepreneurs who are too in love with their own idea, I didn't think I had the clarity to understand if this was something that was a big market or if this was just my geeky, weirdly wired way of buying stuff with spreadsheets. And it was only after talking to lots of people, and not just folks in the startup space, but sitting around and talking to folks in Circuit City, the folks who were actually out on the sales floor, talking to random relatives and friends, that I thought that there might be something more here. And in the course of that, I talked to everybody who I could find in my network. I talked to a guy who I tried to recruit as the VP of engineering at Ontello a while ago, a guy named Scott who was working at Google. I talked to a guy randomly next to me on a plane who I had no idea who he was, but he had a cool phone, and I was flying from the Valley, and I was like, oh, so I'll talk to this guy because it's probably something interesting to talk about. Also happened to work for Google. More about those conversations later. Talk to anybody who I could find who I thought might have interesting perspective on the idea. And while I didn't let anybody throw me in or throw me out of one idea or another, it started to really sculpt to me the way people thought about this, and it helped me build my own vision of what this was. Is this really just a spreadsheet that you sort? Or is this a different kind of experience? Is this something really more fundamental? And that was how I ultimately came up with the one-liner that I used to describe this, which was this is like Kayak for consumer electronics. This is a different kind of search, a kind of search that's targeted to one vertical and can do it better than anything else. That sounded a lot better than buying computers with spreadsheets, as it turned out. So that notion of getting out there, talking to everybody humanly possible, and getting as many eyes and as many brains on the problem as possible was absolutely what brought me to my last choice amongst the 4 ideas I was looking at. I really put this at the bottom. Although it was exciting to me, I thought it was the one with the least potential. And it was only after these conversations that it started to really bubble up. So then it came time to actually figure out who I was going to be working with. I had an amazing conversation with one of the best technical entrepreneurs in Seattle, a guy named Adam Doppel, co-founder of Urban Spoon, and since then, like half a dozen other businesses, some of which he launched in a matter of weeks that are already producing revenue. He's an incredible guy. We hit it off. We had really exciting, enthusiastic conversations. And somewhere along the way, we got to talking about how to build a company. And actually, I think probably the seminal line was, from our conversation was, well, this seems perfect. It seems like we're perfect co-founders, except you don't want to raise investment, and I already have, and I don't want a co-founder, and you're a co-founder. And what should we do about that? That whole, by the way, to have a co-founder or not story is another one I probably don't have time for. The short version is do as I say, not as I do. Co-founders are a great thing. But we had some really in-depth conversations about what we wanted from our businesses. What does success look like? Is success having a great business that can turn profits, pay everybody's salary, and keep everybody excited and engaged in the business for years to come? Is a great success something that you turn over in a year and have a nice exit that you're really excited about and that makes a meaningful difference for the founders financially? Is success multiple $billion or bust? I have a good friend here in Seattle who told me with a completely straight face that if he sells his company for, or if there is an opportunity to sell his company for less than $5 billion, and his board makes him take it, he will resign in protest first, because the opportunity is that big, and he has absolutely no interest in what he would call failure. And God bless him, he means it. And that's amazing. That's not me, but that's incredible. And understanding where you are and where your co-founders are and where your investors are is absolutely essential to building a company that can ultimately be successful. Because if you don't have a shared definition of success, you're all going to be pulling in different directions. So it was with a really deep sense of regret that the two of us decided that we weren't going to work together. And he wound up introducing me to a friend of his, Scott Haug. Scott went on to become the CTO of SparkBuy, and that was probably the most amazing outcome. I still want to work with Adam sometime. We'll figure out some way to make that work. But the right thing tends to happen when you put it all on the table, and the wrong thing tends to happen when you keep these details bottled up inside. If there's one thing I see startup founding teams do that tends to cause the most poison, the most long-term damage, it's putting aside those hard conversations, whether it's around equity splits, around goals, around family obligations, around the time that they can commit to the project. So that was one that I learned. You put that right up front. You make sure that everybody at the table understands what's going on. So, time to start a company. One of the first things I had to do was find a place for us to sit. We were working out of coffee shops, but I'd already learned in my past company that my productivity goes up by a factor of 2 when I actually have to go to work and sit down and focus at a computer and all those sorts of things. So we started getting internet. We started getting real estate. We started getting mail delivery, all those things. And I will tell you a story that to me was just sort of the key the key point about this. As much as this is terrible work that you want to get done as quickly as possible, I got the contract for our lease, and it was a 20-pager. And I called up my attorney, an amazing attorney, one of the best in Seattle, who I won't name because this doesn't make him look good, who otherwise has excellent judgment. And I said, hey, I've got this contract. Would you take a quick look at it? It's a 20-pager, but just give it a skim. And he said, totally happy to do it. My 2 bits for what it's worth. These real estate contracts are really standard, so I'm not going to blame you if you just want to sign it rather than paying one of our legal team to look at it. But I'm happy to do it. And I said, look, just skim it and tell me if there's anything that could go wrong that would cost me more than 1 year's rent. So it was a short-term lease. It was for not very much money. And as I looked at it, I figured the very worst thing that could happen would be that we paid 1 year's rent to get out of it, or whatever was left, right? So I said, if there's anything worse than that, if there's a turn over your firstborn or something like that, I want to know about it. But I don't care about all the details. If they screw me for the security deposit or whatever, that's fine. Just tell me anything more than that. And he said, yeah, okay, I think I can do that in 30 minutes. That's no problem. Called me up the next day and said, I owe you a big apology because boy, did we find a doozy in here. It turns out that the wording of this contract allows the landlord to block the sale of your company. You actually have to get permission from your landlord to sell the company. And if they decide that they want to hold up the deal for a $100,000 cash payment because they can, then they can. So, I've always preached this. It was one of a few of the more stark cases where I say, read your contracts. They suck. They're a pain. Read it once. If it's in negotiation, just read the red lines to keep up. I have found more landmines, more bizarre, crazy things in contracts in the course of doing startups than I could ever have possibly imagined. I remember at one point having a conversation when ultimately I was selling SparkBuy, and we were arguing about something, and I said, this term is completely ludicrous. I mean, please, just take off your you work for Google hat for a minute and just read it as a human being and tell me, would anybody in their right mind sign this? And she sort of paused and she said, I agree with you completely, but you're the first person to object to it. And I said, how could that possibly be? And she said, honestly, this is one of the last papers that people see, and most entrepreneurs are so excited to get the check that they will sign anything at that point. So, read every word of every contract. I wouldn't go quite so far as to say your standard contracts from companies like your ISP and Assembler was the ones who we used for source control. Although, ironically, every single one of those came back to bite us, because when you sell the company, you have to assign every one of those contracts, and every one of them gets looked at by legal and due diligence. So no matter what happens, you're going to wind up responsible for it. That's a little far. I don't necessarily recommend signing the stock contracts from companies, but anything that you're signing, any commercial transaction, you've got to read it. So one of the funny side effects of working with Adam is a guy who, like, you know, ready, fire, aim. He takes lean and quick iteration to an extreme that blows my mind. So he said, when we first started talking, he said, so if we're working together, I think we should ship in 2 weeks. I said, 2 weeks? What are you talking about? You can't ship in 2 weeks. And he said, no. Here's a version of the product that you could ship in 2 weeks. And I said, that's horrible. I wouldn't want my name attached to that. And he said, no. Just get something out there, see what happens. So when I wound up working with Scott, a good friend of his who he'd referred me to, he said, so are you guys going to ship in 2 weeks? I said, no, we're not going to ship in 2 weeks. We've been planning to ship in 6 months. And he said, oh, come on. I could ship this in 2 weeks. You could. And after some back and forth, he kind of made us feel stupid. We said, all right, 6 weeks, month and a half. We think we can do it in 6 weeks, in 1.5 months. So 6 frantic weeks went by. Near the culmination, we're talking about 10 p.m. with a product scheduled to go live at midnight, with me on the phone with, I think it was Siegler from TechCrunch, who couldn't log into the site because his invite had gone into a spam folder, us literally disabling password protection and pushing the site back out so that he could get in, so that he could write the article that was supposed to go live in now an hour and a half. Don't ever go live at midnight. What the hell were we thinking? and all this craziness is going on, and finally, boom, the moment goes, the site's live, it goes up on TechCrunch, there's 500 invitations, and at like 4 a.m. we go to sleep. And we wake up the next morning, and you know, after sleeping for like 3-4 hours, and there's like 20 invites left, and I get an email. It's from that guy on the airplane from like 3 months ago. And he said, hey, Dan, I see you wound up doing the 4th thing that you told me about, the one that you thought was really stupid, but I said, you should totally go do that. That's awesome. You should come over to Google, and we should have coffee. So, fascinating things happen when you ship. And you can't necessarily predict what they are. But it's this unbelievable catalyst. He actually saw us on TechCrunch, pulled out my business card that I'd given him a couple months before, because this conversation had happened well before incorporation or anything like that, and called me up out of the blue. And that was what started the conversation that ultimately led to our acquisition by Google. Randomly talking to a guy who I was sitting next to on an airplane. And it's funny because he's now a friend and we chat regularly. And I sort of went and sat down with him and I said, look, here's what I remember happening, but this is kind of crazy. Like, is this what really happened? And I recounted what I pretty much just recounted to you. And he said, yeah, no, that's pretty much it. The only thing we couldn't agree on was who talked to who first. So anyway, so getting the product out the door was magical. This is not new to anybody, again, who's read the work of Eric Ries or Steve Blank, but it is unbelievable when you've lived it. There is this thin line between humiliating yourself and launching quickly, and one does need to use some degree of caution, but every mistake I've ever seen in my startup life has been one of launching too late and not too soon. So it is just a matter of pushing yourself as hard as you can to make that magic happen. And the most important thing about that, and the most leverage point of that, is it helps the CEO of the company do their job. What is the job of a CEO at a startup? Well, depending on who you talk to, you may hear being the butt on the line for the company. You may hear setting the business strategy or the vision. You may hear at a startup, the CEO is the product person. You may hear it varies from startup to startup, and all these things are true. But there's one common thread that I believe is more important than any other. The CEO's job is to create serendipity. One of the biggest misunderstandings I had when I started my work career was I thought that the way the world worked was like this. You figured out your strategy for whatever it was you were trying to accomplish. You think really hard about it, and you say, I want to partner with this because they're the best partner for this, or I need to hire somebody like that because they're the best partner. You lay out your strategy, and then you doggedly pursue that strategy. If you get new information, you change strategy, but great things happen because you execute against a strategy. And this sounds fine, but it leads to a pretty peculiar side effect, at least in my young adult mind, which was if I randomly ran into somebody and had a conversation about something and it was really interesting, I would say to myself, no, wait, that was not on strategy. Clearly, this weird bit of serendipity, this happenstance coincidence, this can't be important. This won't be the thing that makes the company successful because it's not the strategy. What I learned was exactly the reverse. The things that drive a young company are opportunities. And the job of the CEO and every member of a startup, but particularly the job of the leadership of a company, is to create and exploit these moments of serendipity, these strange opportunities that creep up on us when we least expect it. And that's what things like today are all about. That's what events like this are all about. That's what this community is all about, is giving you the opportunity to find that little lever point, to find that magic conversation. That guy who I had lunch with, that engineer at Google, he was the one who wound up prodding the M&A team every week. Are we done yet? Are we done yet? Have you finished the SparkBuy deal? Wouldn't have happened without them. Matt was the guy who introduced it to the M&A team. That random conversation on the plane wouldn't have happened without that. I can count up a half dozen completely random coincidences that all added up to what was ultimately the success that came about. And none of them I could have planned for. The only thing I could plan for is talking to the person sitting across from you at the table. It is striking up that chat with a person you see on the airplane. It is sending a blind email to 10 people who you think might be able to help, say, here's the problem I've got. Do you have any sort of input on how I could go solve it? It is taking those opportunities to let things happen. It's going to the conference and chatting with everybody on the floor. These are the things that ultimately make startups successful. And so if there's one thing I can leave you with today, it's that succeeding in a startup is all about luck, but it's the kind of luck that you make for yourself. So with that, I'd love to take some questions. I know you've had a long day, your brains are empty, and we're just about done. I think we've got a few minutes for questions. Yep, great. So thank you. Yeah.
You mentioned do as I say, not as I do. Why don't you have co-founders, and why do you think others should have co-founders?
So let me tell you why others should have co-founders, and then I'll tell you why I didn't. So others should have co-founders because, quite simply, the odds of success go up dramatically first. That's just sort of a meta-observation. Some of the reasons for that are co-founders generally are higher quality and less expensive from a sheer dollar standpoint than what you get on the open market. So if I bring in a co-founder CTO, I'm going to wind up paying less cash for that person, a lot more equity. I'm going to pay less cash for that person, so a cash-strapped company will get further, and I'll wind up with a higher caliber person than if I go recruiting for a CTO for a one-person startup who's got no funding or anything else. So for that reason, or on a related point, it's a very positive indicator for investors, advisors, et cetera. Put another way, if you can't convince somebody awesome to join with your vision and to come on board with you and make something happen, everybody who looks at you is going to say, what's the problem here? Why weren't you able to do that? So I had two co-founders at Ontella. I would not change a thing. If I was going to do another company, I'd probably bring co-founders on as well. What happened with SparkBuy was just kind of an odd anomaly, which was I saw this opportunity to go build something really bite-sized and potentially be able to scale it up to be enormous, but I already had interest from actually not one but two different acquirers, and I saw an opportunity to actually, Mark Suster, a tremendous VC out of Los Angeles, put it better than I could have. I apologized to him when I ran into him because I was talking to him about investing and then wound up just sort of shutting that off. And I said, here's the thing. I thought there was a good chance I might be able to sell the company early for a phenomenal outcome, and I didn't want to take your money because that's not the sort of outcome that you're looking for. And he said, actually, I really appreciate that, and I think it's okay to take the local, right? You've got the express, which is you get there really fast, and it's go big or go home, and you've got the local, where you go in the same direction, but you can get off at multiple stops along the way. So one of the downsides of bringing on co-founders is that it divides the equity much more, and I knew that if I did that, it would make it more difficult for sort of an early exit. So I would never have done that with my first company. I wasn't looking to flip this company, but I thought that there were some really interesting opportunities that I wanted to keep open. And so for that reason, the last reason was I'd already lined up financing. And the biggest thing about co-founders is that it's a huge risk mitigation as you go out to get financing. So that co-founder's taking on a ton of risk, but the overall odds of success go up for the company. Once you've established that you've got X dollars in the bank, then you actually can credibly go hire somebody of high caliber, the risk for that person goes down, et cetera. So it was really a lot of reasons that may not apply, certainly don't apply to anybody doing a first-time company and wouldn't apply in many cases subsequently. And the last of which was I just like to do things differently. Ontello was an exercise and raise a ton of money, work on a product for a long time, big launch, and it was really fun. We had a ton of success with that, and I just wanted to try something really different. So yeah, do as I say, not as I do. We've got somebody with a microphone who can amplify your questions. Right over there.
You said you got Siegler on the phone and TechCrunch was ready for your launch. Now, most people in this room can't just call up TechCrunch and get Siegler on the phone. So if you were doing this again, like how would you pull your PR together?
Yeah, neither could I. So here's how I got him on the phone, although it wasn't Siegler now that I remember. And I can't remember which writer it was. Somebody want to Google TechCrunch SparkBuy and they can shout out the answer while I'm telling this story. The way it happened was we hired an intern, phenomenal woman named Christina Anderson. We actually used Intern Match, a company founded in Seattle. Found her to go do PR and marketing. She helped manage Twitter. She was in for probably 10 hours a week. Super smart. So it helped us manage Twitter, helped us manage some company posts and things like that. And when it came time to do Lena Rao? Jason, it was Jason, thank you, Jason Kincaid. Second article, right. So it was Jason, that's right. And so I said, okay, help us come up with a media target list and research all the folks on it and this and that and the other. And so she wound up sending customized emails to about 50 different people. And I worked with her to kind of develop the main talking points. But she cranked these out to a whole bunch of people to get interest. And then she said, TechCrunch, I'm going to put some extra effort into that. So she literally went to TechCrunch, found an article recently that was really flattering about Wavy, Adrian Yoon's company. Cold emailed Adrian and said, how did you get such great coverage of your company? I'm working with this company, SparkBuy, here's what we do. And Adrian said, oh, that sounds cool. Here, let me introduce you to Mike. And so he sent an email to Arrington and said, hey, Arrington, you should cover this. And he said, awesome, I'm going to do it. And we were like, okay, great. And then he wouldn't return mails and wouldn't return, the day before, he's not returning mail, not returning mail. And then sends his email, CC's Jason, says, I'm vomiting all over the place. Jason, can you take this one? Jason took it. So the story of how do you do PR is the same as the story of how you do anything else. You just try lots of stuff until you get lucky. That was what Christina did, and I happen to benefit from it. But to the broader question of how do you manage PR, I have worked with some terrific PR firms. What I found is at the early stages of a company, companies tend to do their own best PR, so having somebody who's sitting there in the room with you to help you out while you sort of find your way, mine your nearby network, and so on is really effective. Once you hit a certain level of scale, then you complement that internal expertise with a PR firm. But really, you do PR like you do marketing, like you do development, like you do anything else, lots of elbow grease. Lots of calls, lots of conversations, and if at all possible, building those relationships up early. So I'll give you a concrete example. If you've got a really cool idea for an article that Xconomy should write, not about you, not about your business, just an article that you would like to see as a reader. You go up to Kurt, and you say, hey, Kurt, I think it'd be really cool to have a top 10 list of BD professionals in Seattle, because technical folks and CEOs get all the credit, but lots of these companies are built on the back. I'm making something up. And Kurt says, cool, thanks. And that's it. Send him an email, tell him that, whatever. He may call you up if he decides to go do that and say, hey, could I get a quote from you or your nominations or that sort of thing? And you do that with the media from time to time. It's not that hard. Their addresses are all public. They're all looking for stories all the time, am I right? And great stories, ideas are helpful, particularly when they're not self-serving. And after you do that for a while, then people answer your email when you send it. So like anything, if you can help, it's much easier to get help. And it's not actually all that difficult to help folks in the media. It's just time-consuming, and that is an unfortunate tax you pay if you want to make PR a core part of your strategy.
One more question, please. Last question.
Right there.
I'm going to cheat a little bit, and it's actually a two-part question. So, first, is it public knowledge how much you sold SparkBuy for?
It's not, and unfortunately, that's one of those, never tell on pain of horrible things happening to me and all my shareholders.
Absolutely. I figured as much. And then the second part of the question is, could you give a little bit of insight, if you know, how Google plans on using SparkBuy in terms of their long-term strategy and how they plan on implementing that into their search?
Yeah, so the question was how Google plans to use SparkBuy in the long term. It was an interesting situation. There was a team at Google that was working on a vertical search problem. It's vertical search in the area of financial products. And the product's called Google Advisor. You can look at it today, google.com/advisor. And they looked at that problem. And they looked at what we were doing at SparkBuy, and they said, wow, these are actually the same problem. One of them is consumer electronics. One of them is mortgages and certificates of deposit. But this vertical search thing we've got to get right. And so they acquired the company to go and sort of remake Google Advisor in that image. So what you're going to see is not the integration of the Spark or redeployment of the SparkBuy project, but rather taking some of the approaches we've used, the technologies and IP we developed, and applying that to these sort of existing products. And you'll see some things rolling out over the next few months. So let me try, because that's not a very satisfying answer, let me try and give you a more useful answer as to what do companies do with their acquisitions. And there's a really helpful framework that was laid out to me by Enrique Gaudreau over at Voyager. He said there's really 3 points on an acquisition scale, and everybody falls somewhere along these 3 points. The first point, the one everybody hears about, is when you acquire a business. That's when you bring in an entire company, business model and all. You may have some redundancy in terms of accounting and everything else, but you plan to use their product line, you plan to use their salespeople, you plan to use their channels, you plan to use their business operations, you're consulting. Like every acquisition GE has ever made is like this, right? You just bring this business in and it pretty much keeps running the same way with a new name. And over time it may change and it may integrate, but the goal is to acquire the business that the company had. Those are the biggest multiples, those are the biggest exits, those are the biggest dollar numbers. In the middle of the scale, you have acquiring a product. You hear a lot about these as well. This is where the company wants whatever it is that you're building, but it's going to snap out various pieces of the infrastructure. It's going to sell your product, but with their internal sales team. Or it's going to take what you're doing and the feature set and attach it to some other product or put them together in a suite or whatever else. So off the top of my head, Google acquired a company called Urchin, which was doing web analytics, and that became Google Analytics. So they weren't monetized, they didn't plan to monetize the same way Urchin did, and it was going to be distributed through Google, but at the end of the day, they wanted that product and to use it whole. And then the smallest, and those are sort of the middle size, the smallest acquisitions are acquisitions for team, where they say, we want those people to work here, but unfortunately they're employed there, so we're going to have to go buy that company in order to make it happen. The smallest transactions are usually team transactions. And it can be, the most extreme case, you hear these acqui-hires, where it's like, we're going to pay a little bit to get the shareholders off their back, and then we're going to hire everybody. And sometimes those happen with failed companies. Sometimes those happen when the people attached to the company are more valuable than the future opportunities. Sometimes there's all sorts of reasons about those. And everything that you see is a point along those lines. We were probably just a little north of the hiring for people, which is to say they weren't planning on having us go work on a bunch of random projects. They wanted the knowledge and the IP that we built up and so on, but they weren't going to keep the product intact. And in fact, it's very difficult for large companies to keep small company products intact because everybody has their own infrastructure and on which things are built. So you generally have to rewrite and transplant anyway. So that's an important thing to think about if you're thinking about selling your companies, where you fall on that meter, because it affects everything about the way that you are evaluated as a company. Are you being evaluated for the people, for the product, or for the business? And if you're trying to tell them how great your business is where they're interested in the product or any other mismatch, then those conversations tend to peter out quickly. Thank you everybody so much for your time.